What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo, and special guest, Andy Martino. SNY's Insider is live from the winter meetings down in Dallas. Andy, have we gotten any sleep over the last 24 hours? We surprisingly got the Juan Soto news at a normal hour.
Yeah, that's been fine, actually. It's been nice because last year, I remember the Soto trade was, and of course I covered the Yankees too, it was one of those deals where like 10, 11 o'clock at night, I'm hearing, oh, they're working on it. So yeah, you can't really sleep. I remember seeing Aaron Boone and Jason Zillow, their head of media relations, in the morning. They were headed to this manager breakfast event. And I was just like, bleep you. You kept me up all night. I'm exhausted. And it was like, you get bitter. But thank you to Steve Cohen and Juan Soto for, if nothing else, agreeing to terms at a reasonable hour. I'm fine.
Yeah, we absolutely loved it on the Mets Pod, considering we had to do an emergency podcast. Reasonable hours, reasonable for you, the life of an insider. Of course, you could subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, or you can watch on YouTube, which many of you are. Drop some questions in there as well. All right, Andy, let's get right into it. You know we got to start with the big man, Juan Soto. Just lay out for us these last few days, how we got here, and how it ultimately all ended with Juan Soto signing a contract to play for the Mets for the next potentially 15 years.
Yeah, Connor, it was a really dramatic couple of days because I can't emphasize enough how much the Mets were just on the sidelines on this thing. Anything you might have heard about the Mets being the front runners or in great position, and there's all kind of wild rumors going around Twitter and stuff, all BS. Like, they were not feeling good about this. They had meetings with Soto. They were fine, but it wasn't like it left them with a ton of optimism. There weren't a lot of contract negotiations, certainly not as much as they would have liked. And yesterday, around 3 p.m. or so, mid-afternoon, it seemed pretty clear he was either going to the Yankees or the Red Sox, to teams that were involved in this process. The Yankees were the front runners all along. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, because Soto liked it there, and they had an advantage from having traded for him and then giving Soto a good experience. So when the Mets get that call from Boris Corp mid-afternoon that it's time to really talk seriously and they might get the player, it was shocking to everyone involved in this, whether it was the Mets, who were all of a sudden getting him, to the Yankees, who were like, we had the momentum and now we don't. The Mets do. So it was really quite a turn of events. And then, as we said a few minutes ago, got done even not that long after at a reasonable hour. So very quick, very dramatic, and a sense of the Mets going, all right, we can get him, whatever, to he's a Met.
So, Andy, this obviously is the Mets pod, so we don't want to delve too deep into the Yankee side of things. But as you mentioned, they were favorites, or they felt comfortable, I should say, probably throughout the process, that they had a good shot here. When push came to shove, when we get to the end of this contract, there really, at its core, is a $5 million difference. And, there's different machinations with the signing bonuses and maybe a couple other kind of idiosyncrasies that we don't know about quite yet. But at its core, now seeing these deals come about and no deferred money in either of them, is it possible that his desire to remain a Yankee was maybe a little overstated?
No, absolutely not. The Yankees and Juan Soto had a good experience together, and people who knew Soto pretty well at the end of the season felt like, yeah, in his heart of hearts, that's a spot for him, that he's really comfortable. But when they got into the weeds of negotiations, one of the things that really did make the difference, I know this has been out there, I've said it, I don't think I'm the only one, but I understand it to really be true, that things like how a family is treated and welcomed, and this isn't to say the Yankees are bad like this, but the Yankees are very by the book. They didn't give Aaron Judge a suite when he signed. They don't do that for players, for the suite for the family. Judge pays for his own suite. So Soto was going to be under the same parameters. It's not families in the clubhouse or in all that many different places on the field kind of organization. And Soto's a real family guy. So during the season, he lived with his mother north of New York City in a house. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people like that are around all the time. This is who he is. He's more of a family guy than a clubhouse guy. He comes into the ballpark, puts on his AirPods, he hits, he works hard, plays hard, goes home to his family. So how your family experiences where you're playing is a really important thing for not even necessarily Soto individually, but for the people around him, for that family. And the Mets, between Francis Mendoza, who is kind of like a den mother to the wives, and Alex Cohen, who is an owner of the team and improved the family room and wants people and their children to be all around and all that kind of stuff. I do really believe that was a separator in the end, but that's not to take anything away from the Yankees and their chances to get him, because they were right there at the end and did have a really good chance to get him.
So, Andy, that dives into a little bit of my next question. I was wondering what the comfort factors were with Soto coming to the Mets. And I've heard you say that about not only, the family atmosphere, but what Alex Cohen has done for this organization. But also, was there any player comfort levels here? I feel like he at least knows multiple guys on the team. And obviously, he was with the Yankees, so he wasn't that far away from all the magic going on in the National League with the Mets this year. Were there other comfort factors involved for him?
I don't think so. Lindor was involved or tried to be involved in the recruiting, but Soto didn't really go back and forth with Lindor very much, from what I understand. It wasn't a relationship thing, and that like a player relationship thing in that way. And as far as the excitement that went on with the Mets, I was in the ballpark. I experienced it. You guys experienced it from your vantage. It was a special time. We went to the World Series with the Yankees, right? So that's extraordinarily special too. So I just really think it came down to Steve Cohen was going to make sure not to lose him over money. And if the offer had to be even more of a separator, it would have. It's not like Cohen was stopping at $765. So there's that. There's money. And then the family stuff. And I think those two factors were the strongest.
As the baseball world just goes around, it's crazy to think that the Mets issued the biggest contract in the history of sports to Juan Soto. And now it's just like, all right, they got that done. Let's figure out what is next. And the first pivot and question is, what does the signing of Juan Soto mean to the future of Pete Alonso returning to Queens?
It's funny to hear like the what's next thing. And they just committed the biggest contract in the history of American professional sports. A well-meaning Mets fan approached me on the set after the hot stuff. She was like, well, nothing's happened today. I'm like, bro, you got Juan Soto yesterday. Come on. But yes, they do have more work to do. Even David Stearns said we got a lot of work to do. Dealing with the Alonso situation is one of those things. The way it's going to work with Alonso, it goes back to like normal. So with something of the magnitude of Juan Soto, that's a Steve Cohen, Hal Steinbrenner, what have you, ownership type negotiation. And Alonso is going to be, how does David Stearns and his group value this player? And the answer is they value him. They like him. They think he's been a very good Met. But now what's the expectation on the contract standpoint from the agent, Scott Boras, and Pete himself? And, like, let's see if they can match up. And I don't think this is going to be a thing that Cohen gets super involved in. It's going to be about whether baseball operations sees that the right deal is on the table for Alonso, and it's early in that process. If another team that's really looking for offense wants to pay top dollar for Alonso's elite power, that team probably has a very good chance to getting Alonso. But that's not to say that the Mets won't get him. It's just sort of starting now that Soto has been resolved.
So, Andy, it's safe to say this team still has at least one hole in the rotation. I guess you could argue two, but we'll say for now there's definitely one clear hole in this rotation. Who are some free agents that you think the Mets are looking at? We haven't really heard them connected to Corbin Burns or Max Fried. Obviously, Sean Manaea was with the team last year and a great success story, so I would think there's contact there. And if the Mets don't like the prices they're hearing in a pitching market that is extraordinary right now, are there names on the trade market, whether it's the high-level guys like Garrett Crochet or Luis Castillo, or maybe even somebody we haven't heard mentioned at all yet?
I think what we're going to see year in and year out with Stearns, and I'm sure you guys are well aware of his history and his philosophy, obviously, and it's going to be a lot more of that on the pitching side. Not only do I not think they're going to get Burns, I think maybe they almost never, in the entire time David Stearns works for the Mets, sign the top pitcher on the free agent market. It's just not what he considers to be a good idea. It would have to be a really special circumstance, and I don't think that circumstance is there this year. If Fried or Burns somehow ends up not getting the offers that they thought they were going to get, maybe the Mets swoop in there. Like that kind of situation is how Stearns operates. So I think Manaea is a guy who is more likely to come back than Luis Severino ever was. If a team wants to blow him away with 5 or 6 years at his age, then he's going to that team. But I'm sensing some optimism that Manaea could be the guy to fill that slot that they still have to fill in the rotation. But if not, they've looked into Walker Buehler. They've looked into any of these guys, names or unnames or trades, anything. And with trades, with Stearns, it's not like, maybe it's Luis Castillo, but maybe it's, Joe Blow that we've never heard of. And that guy turns out to have a good year. We've heard of him, but you know what I mean. No one who's been on our radar. Jose Siri, Tyrone Taylor. I could go on. Like the guys that Stearns has targeted in trades don't tend to be the ones we speculate on beforehand. So I'd say probably we should look in places or acknowledge that we won't be looking in the place that Stearns is looking sometimes.
Andy, a lot of talk is obviously about the rotation and Pete Alonso, but the Mets also have a bunch of holes to fill in the bullpen. How do you anticipate David Stearns building out the bullpen for the 2025 team? Do you think there is a chance for a bigger expenditure, whether that be a Tanner Scott, a Carlos Estevez, one of these higher end relievers, or do you think it's going to be much more of the same of what David Stearns has historically done, which he's trying to find his diamond in the rough? And I know there was rumors about like Jonathan Loaizaga maybe being someone of interest, but how do you anticipate the Mets looking to fill out their bullpen through this winter?
Yeah, combination of those. I wouldn't preclude them from giving a generous deal to a free agent reliever because they can, but those are obviously risky. Relievers are as volatile as any position. But Stearns has not really shot that down when he's been asked, like, would you give a reliever like a 3-year deal or something? He's like, in the right situation. So could happen. Tanner Scott's a guy that's always been rumored with the Mets and the Yankees in different ways, but the industry's always viewed him as a guy who maybe would do better outside of New York. So I'm not so sure that that's front burner. The Loaizaga one's interesting because the Mets have already, in a number of cases, Severino and now Clay Holmes, taking advantage of Carlos Mendoza's inside knowledge of some former Yankees, knowing that these are guys that you want aboard. And there have been guys like Aroldis Chapman who are former Yankees that the Mets haven't targeted that maybe they had some intel there too from Mendoza. So Loaizaga is a guy who's interesting in that way. And I think Mendoza would probably vouch for like he did with Holmes, like he did with Severino. So, yeah, keep an eye on that one.
It seems crazy to say, Andy, but it's wild how quickly a roster can feel crowded. And the Mets aren't there yet because we're so early in the offseason. But looking at the short-term futures of Starling Marte and Jeff McNeil, as we sit here today, we expect them to be on the team. But is there a world where they're thrown out there in trade talks as this roster is not getting crowded just because they signed Juan Soto? But
Sure.
The Mets have a lot of young talent coming up at the AA and AAA level at this team as well.
Well, right now it's hard to see where Marte fits on the roster, right?
Just
and he came back strong at the end of last year and into the postseason, but now they have a right fielder. So, yeah, that's not the easiest contract to move, but it is getting toward the back end of it. So he eats some money, and maybe you can do something there. McNeil, obviously, I think he's actually turned into, in some ways, underrated in the value that he has because it's like Daniel Murphy, but a really plus defender at a number of positions. I think that has a lot of value, but we've seen what's happened with the bat and the way that's been trending. And just culture-wise, in some ways, McNeil was part of something that a core that used to be here. And so you just wonder if there's something creative that they could do there. Again, not selling high there, but you mentioned all the prospects that they have. Obviously, if you hit on one or two of the group of prospects you have at any given time, then you're doing well, and you'll take that. But there's a lot of infielders there, so we'll see what happens with McNeil. But Marte to me is the one where it's even more so like, wait, seriously, where does he play? So we'll see what happens there.
And Andy, when we have that combo, does that just rule out a return of Jose Iglesias? It sounds crazy after how much of a culture guy he was last year, but I just bring up the point of how crowded things can get, how quickly it can get that way.
I don't think you rule out Iglesias because of what he brings, because the clubhouse stuff was real. Sometimes that stuff gets over-talked with guys or it becomes a narrative, but he really was such a unifying person there and a good baseball player. We saw him wear down a little towards the end. But no, and again, the Mets aren't in a position with their infield prospects And Joe, you can speak up if you disagree with me, but there's nobody in the system that you can say, like, we can count on them in the big leagues next year. Acuna had a nice September.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's not like, oh, yeah, that guy's going to be on the roster, whoever it may be, position player-wise, right? I'm not forgetting anybody, am I?
No, I think
so.
You're
You got to
right.
go sign some veterans and then see that play out first before you rely on the kids.
Last one for you, Andy, and obviously thank you for joining us like you always do. What kind of sense are you getting from the winter meetings as far as activity across the industry? Now that Juan Soto is off the board, that theoretically just kicks off everything else. Do you anticipate a lot of action, not necessarily just Mets related, but across the industry over the next 3 days before everyone departs Dallas?
That's certainly the sense. And Stearns said that too today. He was like, yeah, I can get in this sense here that the industry could be a pretty busy winter meetings in the industry. Little surprised that in the 24 hours ish since Soto that hasn't started already, but I wouldn't be shocked if stuff started to drop soon and it became an active meetings. As I sit here right now, there's not a lot of rumblings in here in the lobby behind me of like, oh, such and such is about to happen. But once the seal is broken on an off season, if you will, and now it is with Soto, then the stream of transactions follows.
Andy Martino, SNY insider covering the Mets, Yankees, and the entire league. We always appreciate the time you give us, Andy. Really great insight today. Thanks so much, and good luck the rest of the week down there.
Well, thanks, guys. And I should be thanking you because let me tell you, every time I ever see a graphic in one of our meetings about Mets podcast performance, there's always Shay anything down here way back in the day. And
you laid the foundation.
Mets pod audience is like here. So thank you for having me.
You laid a great foundation, Andy. We appreciate both you and Doug. We'll talk to you soon, all right?
All right, guys. Thanks.
All right, great stuff, of course, from Andy as always, Joe. I mean, a lot to unpack there, right? It's just even more so on the aspect of how the business approach that Soto had throughout this entire thing, and not just financially, but from a family perspective. Obviously everything going forward now with this team. I think it's safe to say, Joe, if you're setting the market, like what the pitching solution is ultimately going to be, it feels like Manaea is obviously the favorite, but not a runaway favorite. I would still call it plus money. And then this wide open field of trade targets we know of, Crochet and Castillo high end, trade targets we don't know of, which we've seen Stearns operate that way in the past. And then a free agent market that in the middle tier, which the Mets will operate in, is wide open.
I find it very interesting when you think about the Sean Manaea market, and Andy spoke to maybe there's some optimism there and maybe something that can work out for the Mets, while also saying the Mets may just never sign the top free agent pitcher, a Corbin Burnes or a Max Fried, and begs the question, if you are willing to give Sean Manaea a 4-year contract, which is clearly where he's trending towards, is there a world where Max Fried gets a 5-year deal or maybe a 6-year deal? And how do you balance that, right? Like Sean Manaea had a fantastic second half, and I think a lot of people in the industry believe what he changed is sustainable, but he still has to prove that it's sustainable. And Max Fried, for example, is a guy is a very good pitcher. So I'd be very interested to see how that all shakes out. But when you think about, as you said, Connor, the starting pitching market as a whole, there's a list of names. I think Nathan Eovaldi is a fantastic fit. We could talk about Walker Buehler. I think that's somebody that pretty much every team in the sport is into, probably, when you think about the potential upside there. And the trade market is something that I think we'll be talking more about here soon.
Yeah, I think so as well. I just think it's Andy touched on this, and was something you and I have discussed with Stearns for a while. You try to pick up on trends, habits, philosophies. You never know, and we will never know. If the Mets didn't sign Juan Soto, were they going to just move some money over and put that on Corbin Burnes or Max Fried? I still think no, and I know you feel similar. I just think it's a philosophy situation with Stearns. He looks at the data and how those contracts work out more than not. And we've said it before, the Zach Wheelers of the world with the Phillies is a massive, massive outlier. More often than not, you have pitching contracts that age really, really poorly based on the term. It doesn't mean that the player won't be impactful for the first couple of years. And that's why the Mets love to live in this world where last year, what did we see? A 1-year deal for Severino, a 2-year deal from Manaea that was, he had the opt-out. And then this year, what do you see? A 2-year deal for Montas with the opt-out. And then Clay Holmes is really more of a project going from the bullpen to the starting rotation. That's why you get him at such a lower number than you typically would for a starter on the free agent market. And that's why you hear them connected to names, not only like Manaea, who, to me, and you've often pointed this out, the biggest question seems to be, will he get that 4th year? It feels like a given almost at this point. I think anything else would surprise us, right?
Yeah, I'd be stunned, and I wouldn't be shocked if it was 5 from somebody.
I love Manaea, but at 33, that's a good for him, I would say. That's awesome for him.
And I think that's probably where the Mets would stand. Maybe they do stretch a year longer. I think in the world ideal for the Mets, they would sign Sean Manaea back for 3 years. That feels like the sweet spot. But when you're dealing with free agency, and especially this market, you end up going a year longer than you want to in order to land the player. And I always go back to a quote from Andrew Friedman back in, I want to say it was 2016, 2017. He's the Dodgers president of baseball operations, I believe. He said, if you are rational about every free agent, you will finish in 3rd on every free agent. So that's the name of the game. And it's going to be an interesting, I don't want to say battle because that seems like there's an issue, but an interesting debate internally of, all right, the Mets here, we signed Juan Soto. We said it on last night's emergency pod. That means it's foot on the gas time. How does he balance that with, this is my philosophy on how I want to build a pitching staff, and how do they intersect? I'm fascinated to see how this all pans out.
Yeah, me too. It's about choosing your overpays, right? I mean, everybody overpays in free agents. Like, that's the name of the game. But at the end of the day, it's trying to get as close to value. And I think the mistake that I see this in football all the time, and it's really relevant in baseball right now. And I think it's very relevant in the market we're looking at right now. I don't mind when a team overpays for greatness, Juan Soto. Right. It's when you overpay for average or good, and you pay great money for average or good, that you find yourself in significant trouble. And I think that ties back to your point, Joe. And that could be hypocritical for me, because there's a world where Manaea is an average pitcher. I love the guy and would love to see him back with the Mets. And if they want him back, the chances are they're going to pay him borderline great, maybe good pitching money for 4 to 5 years for a guy that it wasn't average last year, but when you look at the length of his career, he typically is an average starting pitcher. So that's the tough balance. But I think I know it's a massive need for the Mets. They will have to do something. If they don't bring Manaea back, maybe a little bit unconventional, like a trade, like a name we're not expecting. And we'll dive into all of that and have you cover it all 3 days here for our nightly shows for the winter meetings. But you're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube channel. We take comments there that have a ton of questions and topics in there. We read them on the show. So it's a way for you guys to get involved, or wherever, of course, you get your podcast. So David Stearns spoke today, Joe, and what you have to realize with these media sessions, not every deal is official, so there's a lot of things they can't talk about, or there's guys that they're negotiating with, so they're not going to talk much about that besides, hey, we'd love to have Pete Alonso back and the very generic stuff. We all totally understand it. But in hearing from David Stearns, the Mets president of baseball operations today from Dallas, we want to roll back one clip he said that Joe and I found particularly interesting. Take a listen.
You signed Frankie Montas. I know there's another pending deal that I don't think you can talk about yet, but setting those aside, you still have an appetite, not just to add a starting pitcher, but to add a starting pitcher that you would say to him in negotiations, we can guarantee you a rotation spot.
Yeah, I think we have room for that. I don't think it's a necessity. And so we're going to continue to evaluate the market where we see opportunity to bring in players that we think are going to make us better. We're certainly going to pursue that. But with some of the moves we've been able to make and are working on making, I think we're getting to a level where it's no longer a necessity.
So, Joe, that was listen, we know the Mets need pitching. And this could mean a couple different things, right? It could mean they've been hammering out details of a move that's not announced yet, because every now and then you do get a tweet from a team account that breaks news. The insiders don't grab everything. It could be that they're working through multiple trade scenarios on the table. It could be that they have a more creative plan internally, although I kind of doubt that. You'd be really surprised, right, Joe, if they're sitting here looking at the roster today, counting Clay Holmes, who became official after Stearns spoke, and they're going, we got enough arms right now in our starting rotation. Like, there's not a necessity.
Yeah, I totally disagree with the idea that the Mets don't consider it a necessity. It is absolutely a necessity that the Mets add one more starting pitcher, ideally two, but I can accept one. But what I found interesting about the quote, as you mentioned, it's like, things we've done, things we're working on. And let me be very clear. David Stearns is infinitely smarter than I am. Like that is without debate. So what I think he's saying, he probably is not. He could simply mean the Clay Holmes thing. That could be what he meant, something that they're working on. Or, to your point, Connor, does it mean there's a free agent contract that's coming on the horizon that they think works out? Andy mentioned maybe some optimism with Sean Manaea, and we just talked about him for the last couple of minutes. Could that be something that's in the works? As you said, could it be something on the trade market? We know Garrett Crochet is out there. He is, for me, the number one target, and I would be incredibly aggressive to try to obtain him. Luis Castillo on the Mariners. I know Jerry DiPoto says, I don't really want to trade my starting pitchers, but he also says, I don't know if we really have the budget for the hitters that we need. This all doesn't add up. And Jerry DiPoto, as we've said on this show, he is that guy in your fantasy baseball or fantasy football league that incessantly bothers you to trade. I'd be stunned if Jerry DiPoto made it through this whole offseason and kept all of the starting pitchers. So whether it's those two guys, I know there's been buzz about Jeffrey Springs in Tampa Bay, who could be available. There's been some buzz about Jesus Luzardo from the Marlins being available, which is someone that we talked about, a year or two ago on the show as potential upside option. Look, they need another pitcher. Ideally, it's one that you look at and say, if not established, potential to be a not necessarily ace, but top part of the rotation pitcher. I think that's something the Mets really need to focus on getting before this offseason ends.
So both Ken Rosenthal and Will Salmon of The Athletic reported that the Mets are among teams who have expressed interest in Nathan Eovaldi. We had a question from Wink55 on YouTube. Do the Mets have interest in Nathan Eovaldi? That was the latest on that one. And I think he fits that bucket, Joe, of a guy that he's 34 years old, so more in the Manaea bucket. Pitched to a 3.8 ERA last year, made 29 starts, gave the Rangers over 170 innings. I'm sure they'd love to have him back as well. This is one where you're not getting to that fourth or fifth. You would think. I mean, I should never say because pitching contracts never surprise me anymore. But you would think with Eovaldi, he's a guy that would be more in that 3-year window range and maybe profiles as a backup option if Manaea's contract somehow got to 5 on the open market.
Yeah, Joel Sherman at the Post talking about Nathan Eovaldi. He speculated a 3-year deal. So I think that you're kind of right in line with what people in the industry believe. I think Eovaldi is a fantastic fit for this team. While the Mets certainly are hunting upside, and that's clearly David Stearns' MO, is he wants to hunt these guys with some flaws that he goes between Jeremy Hefner and Desi Druschel now as the assistant pitching coach, our sports science team, our analytics team, we could fix pitchers. And, very successful year one. It's not going to work every single time. So I think the Mets need to find some stability. And I think Nathan Eovaldi could provide exactly that. As you said, he threw 170 innings. He's been largely healthy the last 3 to 4 seasons. I think he is a perfect fit to round out a rotation of maybe some risk with some certainty. And also, don't forget, he is one of the best playoff pitchers in the entire sport. Every time Nathan Eovaldi steps on the mound during the playoffs, it's like he finds the ace stuff that you're looking for. So to me, Nathan Eovaldi is a fantastic fit.
And great call about his consistency, Joe. I mean, since 2021, so 4 seasons, he made 32 starts in 2021, 20 in 2022, 25 in 2023, 29 last year. ERAs of 3.75, 3.87, 3.63, 3.8. Strikeout over
You know what you're
9,
getting.
9.6, 8.5, 8.3, 8.8. He is the same guy every single year. It is unbelievable. And your point about the postseason is so important. It's something we talked a lot about with Stanek last year going down the stretch. As much as Stanek struggled during the regular season, we knew the Mets needed guys that have a proven track record in the postseason, because that is the expectation for the Mets now, that they will be playing in postseason baseball. What you feel great about with the Mets right now is Francisco Lindor can get the big hit. Juan Soto can get the big hit. Mark Vientos can get the big hit. Hopefully Pete Alonso's back. He can get the big hit. What you need now is arms that you feel good about on the mound, because when the lights are that bright in the postseason, being on the mound is stressful. And Manaea was great under the lights last year, which proves a good case for him to be back until he really wore down on the last start he had to make. But yeah, it's a great point about Eovaldi and why he's on their radar. And it just goes to show you the depth or volume of options the Mets have. We live in a world now where it's great, where Mets fans never react to the first move. And the first move is Frankie Montas, where we're kind of looking around like, that's an interesting move. It's a classic Stearns bet. But the whole picture at the end of the day, I think everybody will feel good about what they accumulate, not only on this roster, but more specifically in this rotation. All right, another question on YouTube here from Andre. How do you think the Soto signing with the family emphasis during recruiting, along with the pitching lab, will impact this Roki Sasaki recruiting? Joe, I can't believe we made it that far into the winter meeting shows. We're on show 2. We are about a half hour into it, and we have not talked about Sasaki. This is a shame on me moment, Joe, because I have really put him out of mind, just thinking he's a Dodger, he's a Padre, he's somewhere that's not the Mets. But I think it's time to dream big and think about Sasaki potentially signing with the Mets. You never know.
Hey, Connor, it's been out of my mind too, because I feel the exact same way. I believe he is a Dodger or a Padre until he's not.
Right.
However, is there something the Mets can do? If there's one thing that they are showing, is they have the ability to recruit. Steve Cohen is a recruiter. Alex Cohen is a recruiter. Frankly, if you want to go back a couple of years with Kodai Senga, Jeremy Hefner has some recruiting chops to him as well.
Right.
So I think the Mets are going to meet with Roki Sasaki. I think every team's going to try to meet with Roki Sasaki. And you know what? Maybe the Mets have a big enough winter where they sign, obviously, Juan Soto, which, again, it still blows my mind that we've just moved on. The Mets signed Juan Soto for $765 million.
Sickening, sickening world.
It is crazy, but hey, 24 hours is a lifetime in this world. But Roki Sasaki is a guy, if the Mets can get their hands on him, he might be the best valued asset in the entire sport. And I don't even think that's hyperbolic to say. You could think about Paul Skeens, I think maybe in a similar light, but Sasaki has that true ace potential. He's 23 years old. He's up to 100, crazy splitter, breaking ball. Everything about him screams future star. Now, the only question is, does this guy have any interest in coming to the East Coast, or is he, like, honestly, a lot of the Japanese players end up being West Coast preference, closer to the home country and things along those lines. So money can't win here. Steve Cohen can't do the Juan Soto and just keep stacking the bid until everyone else bows out. Everyone's in the same world. You're signing this guy for $5 to $8 million, depending on where each team is at as far as international signing bonus goes. But man, this is something the Mets should really try to do.
Yeah, it would be the surprise of the offseason. Soto doesn't qualify as the surprise. It's amazing, but we were hopeful the Mets can find a way to get Soto. If you were setting the odds, the Mets would be one of the favorites to get Soto. Not the runaway favorite, but one of the favorites. Sasaki, they're all the way down the board. As we said, the Dodgers and the Padres are at the top. Every team is going to be on Sasaki because, once again, he's not somebody that he gets posted and then it's a free range of Yamamoto last year, over $300 million. That's not Sasaki because he's going to sign that entry-level deal with international bonus money. But it would completely alter the long-term outlook of the Mets pitching if they got Sasaki. That would be the craziest part of it. All right, this one from Football Nut on YouTube. Winker, ? Peterson, ? Mets need a left-handed bat to pair with Marte at DH. I mean, yes and yes from me, Joe. Jock Peterson, obviously a guy that is king platoon player. Jesse Winker had a lot of success here last year, although wouldn't shock me if Winker was a true rental. If he can go maybe do better somewhere else, who knows? I mean, the Mets have invested a lot of money into this offense, and I think they're going to continue to as they try to bring back Pete Alonso. But I kind of want to change this question, Joe. You could talk about Winker and Jock Peterson, but I want to ask you as well. Do you think the Mets are even interested in adding a bat here to platoon at DH, or do they kind of have enough in-house, assuming Alonso's back, which is maybe a dangerous assumption?
I just want to say, when you said Winker ? Peterson ? I was like, what is the relevance between Jesse Winker and David Peterson?
You can hear it in my voice because it was spelled the way David Peterson spells his name, not the way Jock spells his name. So I was like, this could go a couple different ways.
But when it comes to the DH situation and a left-handed option to pair with potentially a Starling Marte, even though, as Andy pointed out earlier in the show, is it a kind of square peg, round hole, almost in a sense on the roster?
I don't agree with that, by the way. And I didn't want to hold on. Andy's got enough things to do, so I didn't want to start like having a silly debate conversation while he's being very generous to us with his time. But I really like Marte's limited role on this roster.
I do as well, and the issue you run into is it's bodies at this point, right? You have Juan Soto, you have Brandon Nimmo, you have Starling Marte, you have Tyrone Taylor, you have Jose Siri.
Yeah.
How many are you going to carry? 6 pseudo outfielders and 2 DHs, and how does that impact what you do in the infield? There's a numbers game here, so I don't know how this is all going to shake out, and it may be a situation where they don't do that platoon type of thing at DH. It might be Starling Marte is a primary DH and he's just spelled on days that he needs to be spelled by somebody else. I just don't know if they could carry that many quote unquote outfielder type guys on the roster.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's because something's got to give, I guess, is kind of how you look at it, where you go, okay, you ran through it, and it's, I mean, obviously, if you count McNeil, they would have 6 outfielders, you would think. And obviously, McNeil has position versatility. But it makes you run into the fact, do they like that versatility and they prefer to keep McNeil? Or do they think about, or do they go to the other route with Marte? Do they go, we'd rather trade Marte? And obviously, they have to eat money on the final year of the deal.
Sure.
I just go back to, the Mets have a ton of defense in the outfield with Taylor and Siri now. That's the good. And when Nimmo is healthy, Nimmo is a good corner outfielder. Like, let me not take away anything from Nimmo. Obviously, Soto and Marte once upon a time was a really good outfielder. Soto is not. But you can live with that, with those guys, because you have if you're closing out a game with Nimmo, Siri, and Tyrone Taylor, you are fine in terms of defensive replacements. So yeah, it goes back to your point. You can kind of fix this roster where you go, Marte is really just a DH. Like, yeah, we could stick him out there with a glove if we needed him to pinch run and we're in a crunch in extra innings or whatever it is, but he's really just a DH. It just depends how much they value his bat. And for those that are kind of like looking at it and going, man, Marte is not the same bat he once was, I understand why people are thinking that, especially with the injuries, but you have to keep in mind with the splits. Marte had an 844 OPS against lefties last year. Marte still hits left-handed pitching really well. I was going to say demolishes. I'm not really there yet, but he hits it really well. So,
and he was awesome in the playoffs, Connor, against both-handed pitchers. Like, he was working great at bats. He was ripping the baseball seemingly every time up. Marte looked right in the playoffs, and that's the biggest thing. And I'm sure this is what you were going to kind of allude to. The biggest thing is, how can you keep this guy healthy? Because if you can keep him healthy, I'm not saying he's going to go and hit 310 like he used to, but I don't think the bat is just gone for Starling Marte.
No, he's a guy that could hit 270, steal you 15 to 20 bags, hit some home runs against lefties. This is why Stearns gets paid the big bucks to figure this out, and Mendoza as well. I would like the Mets to find a way to build this roster that they can keep Marte on it. I know it's easier said than done, but I would definitely prefer that. What do you think of the whole idea, though, that they definitely need another left-handed bat? Do you think they're short in that area right now? Because even if they bring back Pete, that doesn't solve that issue.
Right. I mean, they do get a little right-handed, right? That's certainly, especially when you think about how they have both Jose Siri and Tyrone Taylor, similar to last year when their center field duo was two right-handed hitters. And theoretically, you're trying to build a lefty and a righty when you split it up. But the Mets have now back-to-back years gone righty-righty as their center field options. It's just we have to like go through the roster and do the math. Like how many of these guys can you fit? And
Right.
What are you losing? Like, let's say the Mets do bring Jesse Winker back, which clearly you and I on this show would have no opposition to Jesse Winker being back on the Mets. What do you lose by bringing Jesse Winker back? Does it mean you can't bring back Jose Iglesias? Does it mean you can't carry Ronnie Mauricio or Luisangel Acuna? Like these different things that you have to think about from a roster construction standpoint. It just feels like it would be a lot of bodies for just a couple spots on the roster.
That's the tricky part. You do run out of the, hey, we don't care about what this guy is defensively. Like you run out of those tickets. You do. You definitely do. At some point, you have to start caring. And we know Stearns prioritizes the defense so much, which could lead to a chance that Iglesias is back. I mean, Iglesias, you can stick his glove at any spot in the infield, and you feel overall pretty good about it. All right, how about this one from Alan Weinman on YouTube? I realized Jordan Montgomery was bad last year, but good in the past. If Arizona eats a lot of the money, is he a consideration? So this one to me, Joe, Montgomery obviously was really bad last year. It was kind of a funky year. He gets the late start. He does make 21 starts. He pitches to a 6.23 ERA. He's just not the guy that, to be fair to Montgomery, I mean, this is someone before that since 2021 had a sub-4 ERA every year. That's a really good track record. I would be interested in Montgomery in this scenario if he's one of two ads. I can't talk myself into, let's bet on a bounce back for Jordan Montgomery. And we go into the year and our pitching gambles were, and I'm Stearns believer number one. But even with that being said, your pitching gambles would be a guy that was dreadful last year in Montgomery, an ERA over 6. Frankie Montas, who's a project, one where we believe in, we're excited about, but a project in some ways with health concerns. And Clay Holmes converting from the bullpen. So Montgomery would have to be one of 4 new additions to me. That's a true, I would treat him like a fifth starter. Let's see what happens here. I don't know if Arizona, the kind of market they play in, if they're going to eat that much of the money that you treat it that way. What do you think of him?
Yeah, I think Jordan Montgomery's a prime bounce back candidate, and I think that's what people in the industry believe. So I think a lot of people are looking at this as, oh, you just call Arizona and say, pay 15 of the 22 million, and we'll just take them off your hands. Problem solved.
Right.
I think
everybody would do that.
Anyone would take that shot eventually. Essentially, the Diamondbacks floated trying to swap him for Cody Bellinger with the Cubs. So they're valuing him, and despite everything with the owner saying how horrible of a decision it was to sign him and everything that transpired, let us not forget we were doing these shows a year ago, maybe not literally today, but around a year ago today, and I was dodging bullets like I was in the Matrix of everybody yelling that the Mets had to give Jordan Montgomery a 5-year deal, a 6-year, a long-term contract, because he had been a proven, in a way, a lot like Nathan Eovaldi, right? Where it's proven playoff performer, reliably takes the ball every time. And one thing about Montgomery that intrigues me is he is not nearly as old as you think he is. When I went and started looking into him heading into the offseason, I was just like, I thought Joe Montgomery was 35 years old. He's 32. And, maybe this is a situation, Connor. I don't think it's not an exact fit. Maybe this is a swap Starling Marte, Jordan Montgomery situation. I know Diamondbacks have a ton of outfielders, so maybe that's not a perfect fit. But
what about Jeff McNeil? More complicated, tough. Right?
It's more complicated. I think if the Mets trade Jeff McNeil, which I'm open to because I'm open to doing nearly anything, I think the pressure then goes heavy on Luisangel Acuna, because I don't think the Mets can sign Jose Iglesias back and say, hey, Jose Iglesias is the starting second baseman. I don't think that would fly in 2025. I think Jeff McNeil is probably a keep, and maybe it's something where he has to rebuild his value. But big picture, Jordan Montgomery interested. And I do kind of fall in line with you that if he's, call it the next starting pitcher they add, I would want another one to feel good about the rotation.
Well, it's a perfect transition to our Down on the Farm, where I think it's a good time to talk about Luisangel Acuna, because he becomes the lost man in all these combos, whether it's McNeil, in or out, Iglesias back, who knows. Does Acuna have a real shot to make this opening day roster, Joe, or does he feel like the guy that you get the first injury or long slump that you call up to maybe give a boost and you want to give him some more time in AAA? As crazy as his run was at the end of the year that nobody saw coming.
His run at the end of the year was fantastic. I mean, let's call it what it is. The Mets lost the Mets lost Francisco Lindor for 9 days or whatever it was, and they took a kid who, let's also call this what it is too, Connor. He was not particularly good in AAA. He didn't hit, and when he did, it was not for a sustained period of time. But he stepped right in. He took on the big stage, and he performed offensively in a big way. Hit a couple home runs. And what always impressed me was the way he handled defense. And these are the biggest games in a playoff push. And he was fielding grounders like a 10-year veteran. So one of the big positives about Luisangel Acuna is the baseball IQ is so high with him. He's never going to feel out of place. But with Jeff McNeil, I think probably more likely than not to remain with the Mets. I don't want to carry Luisangel Acuna on opening day as a super sub. I would almost rather send him back to AAA, and maybe he hits better in AAA this time around, coming off the great end of the season and how he's performed now in the Venezuelan Winter League, which, from a competition standpoint is more like AA, but he's saying 317 as like an 850 OPS, I believe it was, something along those lines down in Venezuela. So clearly, Luisangel Acuna is trending in the right direction. I wouldn't want him on the opening day roster if it meant he was just going to be a super sub.
Yeah, it makes sense. You want player development to take precedent here, right? And you look at Acuna, I mean, how quickly we forget he hasn't even turned 23 years old. So it was amazing that he got that cup of coffee in the majors, because boy, did he shine when the lights got brighter. It was like he fed off the adrenaline, and he clearly fit in right away with this clubhouse and this team, and there's a place for him, and he can play a lot of different positions. He brings up defense and speed, which is, as the Mets veteran group becomes more fixated on offense, when you think of Soto being here, I guess it's weird to call Vientos a veteran because he's not, but Vientos is a more offensive. He's a sure thing in the lineup in terms of, we know Vientos is batting near the top of the order and he's expected to hit. Having young defense and speed is really important in a system, because you never know when you're going to need to call that up to help with an injury, to help with just supplement the roster, rather than paying for it. Let's not forget last year, there was a world where the Mets gave out a major league contract to Joey Wendell, and it wasn't a lot of money, so you don't go nuts over it, but it didn't work out, and you cut him, and it's better to have those guys in the system instead. All right, Joe, any closing thoughts here? We're kind of getting to the end of this is our first official Winter Meetings pod, because let's not forget, last night was the emergency podcast. We will be live at 8 p.m. tomorrow. We will be live at 8 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday. We have more guests coming your way. It's going to be really awesome. Andy's insight is always phenomenal, but I think things are going to get really interesting here, Joe. It feels like the Mets are hell-bent on not only keeping in touch with Pete Alonso and seeing where that goes, but bolstering what they have in the starting rotation and ultimately what they're going to have under Edwin Diaz in this kind of thin bullpen at the moment.
I think this is going to be a very active next couple of days, and I think that's kind of across the industry, across the sport. I'm hopeful that the Mets make some moves, because, boy, would I love to just hop on the show. And honestly, I was waiting while we were talking to Andy Martino. I was just like, Andy's going to break something while we're talking. Just all of a sudden, he's like, hold on a second, guys. The Mets did this. I was waiting for that. Obviously, it hasn't happened. And it feels in a lot of ways like the calm before the storm. Juan Soto happened. That was the big news, and it's dominated for the last 24 hours. And as Andy said, largely nothing else has transpired. Feels like the calm before the storm, and I'm excited to come back tomorrow and talk about this all again. And hey, everybody out there that always asks us for more podcasts, for more content, they want to see more of Joe and Connor. Well, you're going to get 4 days in a row of us. So be ready for it.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. We will be back Tuesday and Wednesday night live at 8 p.m. Eastern on all of SNY's digital platforms with more guests, news, and notes from the MLB winter meetings in Dallas. Of course, if you miss those shows live, just subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your shows. You'll have the podcast downloaded for you the next day. Leave us a review, please, with a question. We'll look for it for a future mailbag. And, of course, you can watch the show on SNY's YouTube channel. Please become a subscriber over there as well. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you tomorrow night.